The lease termination notice was sitting on my counter for 3 days before I could bring myself to touch it. November 8th, 2023. My landlord's lawyer had given me until December 1st to vacate the premises, the little bookshop on Elgin Street that my grandmother had opened in 1987, the same year I was born. 36 years of her life were in those walls, 14 of mine. I was wrapping her favorite ceramic owl in newspaper when the black SUV pulled up outside. You don't see many government vehicles parking on Elgin Street on a Tuesday afternoon. You definitely don't see a woman in a charcoal blazer carrying a legal binder walking into a bookshop that's been selling clearance mysteries for the past 8 months just to stay open. She held the door for the man behind her. He was tall, mid-30s, dark coat, carrying nothing. His hands were in his pockets and he was looking around the shop like he was trying to memorize it. The woman checked her phone, then looked directly at me. "Ms. Whitmore," she said. "My name is Daphne LaRocque. I'm a federal prosecutor with the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. The man beside me has spent 18 months building a case that involves you, your shop, and a fraud scheme operating across 4 provinces." She paused. "But before we go any further, he wanted to ask you something." The man stepped forward, and when he smiled, something cracked open in my chest. "Do you still have the copy of Charlotte's Web you gave me?" he said. "You wrote something on the first page." My hand found the counter. I held on. "My name is Sylvie Whitmore, and I need to tell you how a single night in a snowstorm unraveled my entire life and then put it back together again, better than it ever was. Go back with me." January 2007. I was 19, home from Carleton for the winter break, helping my grandmother run the shop during the Christmas rush. Gran had been managing alone since my grandfather passed, and the shop was her heartbeat. Elgin Street books had never been profitable, not really. But it had been hers, and that made it worth everything. I adored her. She was the kind of woman who remembered every customer's favorite author and kept a jar of lemon drops on the counter because, she said, nobody stays grumpy after a lemon drop. That January was the coldest Ottawa had seen in a decade, the kind of cold where your breath freezes before it leaves your face. Gran had been getting tired faster than usual. She'd asked me to close up alone that night, which I'd done 100 times before, so I didn't think anything of it. I was counting to till $63, which felt like a small victory, when I heard something behind the back door. We shared an alley with a Thai restaurant next door, and I thought one of their prep cooks had knocked something over. But then I heard it again, and it wasn't the sound of anything falling. It was the sound of someone trying very hard not to make a sound. I opened the back door. The boy was maybe 11. He had a school backpack that was half unzipped, one mitten, and a jacket that was entirely wrong for January in Ottawa. He was pressed flat against the brick wall, trying to disappear into it, and when the light from the door hit him, he flinched like he expected something to happen. "Hey," I said, "are you okay?" He shook his head once. Then he just stood there, like that was the only honest answer he had. His name was Eli. He'd been walking for 2 hours in -20 weather because he didn't know where else to go. He was in the foster system, had been since he was 7, and the man in his current placement had a temper that got worse on nights he drank, and he drank every night that ended in a Y. Eli had taken his backpack and his library card and left after dinner. I brought him inside. I made him tea and heated up the soup I'd brought for myself. Butternut squash, Gran's recipe, the one she'd been making since before I was born. Eli drank 2 mugs and then sat with his hands wrapped around the third one like it might disappear if he let go. He was quiet, not shy quiet, observant quiet, the kind of quiet where you realize the person is watching everything and thinking about it carefully before they say a word. After a while, he asked if he could look at the books. "Help yourself," I said. He walked the shelves for 20 minutes, not pulling things out randomly the way kids usually do, methodically, reading the back covers, putting them back exactly as he found them. When he got to the children's section, he stopped at Charlotte's Web. He'd read it before, he said. He'd read it 4 times, but he'd never owned a copy. I took it off the shelf and I wrote on the first page to Eli, "This one's yours. The world needs more people who notice things." Sylvie, January 2007. I called the youth crisis line that night. They connected us with an emergency placement coordinator, and within 2 hours, Eli had a safe place to sleep. He left with the book, his backpack, and one of Gran's lemon drops, which he examined carefully before putting in his pocket like something valuable. I thought about him for weeks after, wondered if he was okay, wondered if the new placement was better. Eventually, the way these things go, life moved forward, and Eli became a memory I kept in a quiet corner of my heart. Gran died in March 2009. She'd been slowing down all through the winter. Less energy, some confusion, a new medication my uncle had insisted she try for her blood pressure. She kept telling me the new pills made her feel foggy, not like herself. I tried to raise it with him, but he had a way of turning concern into condescension. You know the type. The kind of person who uses the word actually like a weapon. She passed on a Tuesday morning. Her doctor said it was cardiac arrest, not uncommon in a woman of 78 with her history. I was at school. My uncle was there. By the time I got home, he had already spoken to the estate lawyer. Gran had changed her will, apparently, 6 weeks before she died. The house went to my uncle. A small RRSP. Some jewelry. The bookshop came to me. Just the business, not the building. I got a lease, a set of keys, and a storage room full of her handwritten inventory notes. The lawyer read it the way you'd read a grocery list. My uncle looked appropriately sad. I caught him checking his watch. The first sign that something was wrong came 2 weeks after the funeral, when a man named Gareth Voss showed up at the shop. He was a property developer, mid-50s, the kind of man who wears a cashmere scarf in the spring because he can. He told me he wanted to buy out my lease, offered me $40,000, said he was doing me a favor. The street was declining, the foot traffic was down, I was young, and I had options he didn't. Something about the way he said options made my skin go cold. I told him the shop wasn't for sale. He smiled like I'd said something naive and left his card on the counter. Within 3 months, my uncle and Gareth Voss had apparently become close friends. I found out at the worst possible time. My first anniversary of running the shop alone, November 2009, when a city inspector arrived with a clipboard and a list of violations I had never seen before and did not recognize. Improper fire egress, inadequate ventilation in the storage room, structural concerns on the east wall, the wall that had been standing perfectly fine since 1987. The inspector was apologetic, professional, and entirely unyielding. I fixed everything. It cost me $4,000 I didn't have. I put it on a line of credit. 3 months later, another inspection. More violations. Different ones this time. None of them from the same list as before, as if someone was rotating through a handbook. That was when I started the notebook. I'm not sure why I started it. Some instinct maybe. Some sense that things were too coordinated to be coincidental. Every time I repaired something, a new problem appeared. Every time I pushed back, my uncle called to remind me how hard it was to keep a small business afloat, how maybe Gran would have understood if I'd let it go. I wrote down every inspection date, every violation, every call, every letter. I took photos with my phone. I kept copies of everything. My regular customers started to notice. There was a retired librarian named Adine who came in every Thursday for a new mystery novel and stayed for 45 minutes discussing the previous one. She was in her late 70s, sharp as a new blade, and she had seen enough of the world to recognize when something was off. That Voss man was at the city planning meeting last month, she told me one afternoon. He had 3 council members with him. I don't like the look of that at all. The harassment ran in cycles. A year of fake violations, then a year of permit delays on repairs I needed to make. Then a letter from a lawyer questioning whether the original lease was valid because Gran had allegedly signed it when she was already showing signs of cognitive decline. That last one kept me up for weeks. I had to hire my own lawyer to respond, which cost me more than I'd spent on groceries that month. And then, in 2013, something unexpected happened. Money orders started arriving. $240 a month. Never a name. Never a return address. Just a Canada Post money order and a small piece of paper that said, "From someone who hasn't forgotten." The first one arrived on a Thursday. I sat in the back room with it for a long time before I could make myself do anything with it. Then I cried, which I hadn't let myself do in 4 years, not properly, because it meant someone knew I was struggling. Someone out there, a real person, had decided that mattered. The money came like it knew exactly what I needed. When my heat pump failed in February 2015, that month's money order was $800 instead of $240, and it covered the repair almost exactly. I had no way of explaining that. I told myself it was coincidence. I couldn't let myself believe anything else, because if I believed it, I'd spend all my time trying to figure out who it was instead of keeping the lights on. My uncle escalated in 2016. He sold the building, Gran's building, the one she'd leased to herself for 30 years, to a number company I couldn't find any information about. The next month, I received notice that my lease was under legal review. My lawyer found the clause buried in the original agreement. The lease was valid and unbreakable until 2037, as long as I maintained continuous operation. Gran had insisted on that language back in 1987. Her own lawyer had apparently thought it was excessive. Gran had said she didn't care. I'd never loved her more than I did reading that clause. Gareth Voss came back in 2018. He'd gotten older but not warmer. He sat across from me at the counter and offered me $90,000 to voluntarily terminate my lease and vacate. He said the neighborhood was changing, true enough, and that I'd be smart to take the money before the business declined further. I asked him what was under the building. He went very still. I didn't actually know anything specific. I just noticed, over the years, that his interest in this particular address had never wavered, despite far more profitable opportunities appearing around it. You don't stay fixated on a tiny bookshop on Elgin Street for 9 years unless there's something worth staying fixated on. I don't know what you mean, he said. I think you do, I said, and I think I'll be keeping the lease. He left. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from the city informing that the building had been flagged for a structural assessment. The assessment found a hairline fracture in the east foundation wall that the inspector described as requiring urgent remediation. The cost estimate, $260,000, to be borne by the leaseholder under the terms of my agreement. I appealed, lost. Appealed again. Lost again. My lawyer told me she'd never seen an assessment move so quickly from filing to finding. She said she couldn't prove anything, but she'd seen his pattern before. The termination notice came November 2023. Failure to remit remediation costs. 30 days to vacate. I spent the first 3 days in shock. Then I started packing, the way you pack when you've already grieved. Slowly, deliberately, making space in yourself for the loss before it officially arrives. I gave books to customers. I wrote letters of reference for the 2 part-time staff I'd hired over the years. I called a dean who was 91 now and still reading mysteries. And she cried on the phone and told me Gareth Voss was going to get exactly what was coming to him. She felt it in her bones. I baked. When I'm frightened, I bake. Always have. Gran's shortbread, lemon loaves. By November 20th, I had enough baked goods to stock a small bakery, and nowhere near enough courage to finish packing the back room. That's where I was, sitting on the floor surrounded by boxes and shortbread, when the SUV pulled up outside. The man beside Daphne LaRocque hadn't spoken since he asked about the book. He was watching me with that same careful attention I remembered from a boy who walked the shelves for 20 minutes before touching anything. "Ellie," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. "Hi, Sylvie." He said it simply, like we'd spoken last week. "I'm sorry it took me this long." "Doctor me this long." "Doctor a song, Ilio say now," he told me later, not then. He'd done his undergraduate degree at McGill at 17, his master's at 19, and his doctorate in financial forensics at 23. He'd founded a company called Clear Ledger that built AI systems to detect fraud in real estate and municipal contracting. The RCMP had contracted them in 2021. The Public Prosecution Service had brought Daphne LaRocque in to lead the resulting case. But I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew was that he was standing in my shop, and the world had shifted under my feet. Daphne was already spreading documents across the counter. Ms. Whitmore, she said, I need to tell you what we found, and then I need to tell you what's happening in the next 48 hours. The numbered company that had bought my building was called 1422897 Ontario Inc. Gareth Foss controlled it through a chain of 3 shell companies, 2 of which shared a registered address with another numbered company that had purchased 14 other properties across Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and British Columbia, all of them small commercial properties, all of them occupied by long-term leaseholders, all of them subjected to the same pattern of inspections, violations, permit delays, and eventually fabricated structural assessments. 11 of those leaseholders had given up and vacated. 3 had died during the process, elderly business owners who'd spent their final years fighting. 1 had lost everything to legal fees. I was the last one standing. Why? I asked. What's so valuable about these properties? Eli answered. Yours specifically? There's a federal transit corridor study from 2019. The LRT expansion has 3 proposed routes. One of them runs directly under Elgin Street. The expropriation value of the properties along that route, paid out to the owners at the time of expropriation, would be significant. Gareth Foss has been acquiring those properties for years. He is a contact inside the transit authority who gave him the preliminary route data before it was public. He paused. Your building would have been worth somewhere between $4 and $7 million in expropriation proceeds. He was trying to get your lease terminated so he could take that money himself. I sat down. I didn't mean to. My legs made the decision. The structural assessment, Eli continued. We've had 3 independent engineers look at the foundation report. There is no hairline fracture. The inspector who wrote it has now given a full statement to the RCMP. He was paid $12,000 to file a false report. He's been cooperating for 6 months. Daphne took over. Gareth Voss was arrested this morning at his home in Westboro. Your uncle is being arrested right now at his office. She said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, carefully, without editorializing. The charges include fraud over $5,000, breach of trust, and conspiracy. We also have reason to believe your grandmother's will was altered with your uncle's involvement. We have a forensic document examiner's report and your uncle's financial records showing a transfer from one of Voss's accounts 4 months before your grandmother died. The white pills. I hadn't thought of those words in years, but they surfaced now. Gran, telling me the new medication made her feel foggy. My uncle insisting it was the right treatment. The fog she never came out of. Her death, I said. Was it? We don't have sufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges related to your grandmother's death, Daphne said. Not a comfort, but the truth. What we do have is evidence that the will was fraudulently altered. Civil proceedings have already been filed. Eli pulled out a tablet. There's one more thing. He turned it toward me. I need to show you something. It was a recording from a restaurant. Hidden camera footage. Time-stamped 3 weeks ago. My uncle and Gareth Foss, having dinner at a place in the market. They were relaxed. Drinking. And my uncle was talking. The inspection report scared her. She's packing. Give her until the 1st of December and the lease is abandoned. We don't even have to go to court. 36 years of that old woman's life in that shop, and Sylvie's gonna walk away from it because she doesn't know she's sitting on $7 million. He laughed when he said it. An actual laugh. I went very quiet inside. The kind of quiet that is not peace. The arrests are simultaneous, Daphne said, checking her phone. Both are in custody now. She looked at me with something careful in her expression. I know this is a great deal to process. What happens to the shop? I asked. An emergency injunction was granted by a federal court judge yesterday morning. She laid a document on the counter. The termination notice is void. The structural assessment has been formally discredited. Your lease stands. She paused. And given the fraudulent nature of the remediation demand, you have grounds for substantial civil damages. I looked at Eli. He was watching me with that same still attention he'd had at 11 years old. Except now he was a grown man in a dark coat, and the bookshop was full of boxes I hadn't finished packing. The money orders, I said. He nodded. $240 a month. I said. For 10 years. How did you know how much? I looked at your business filings, he said simply. They're public record. I calculated your average monthly shortfall against what a viable small bookseller should be generating. In 2015, when your heat pump failed, I'd been tracking your municipal permit filings and I saw the service request come through the city system. I increased that month's amount. You hacked the city's permit database. I was 21. I've since developed more legitimate methods. He almost smiled. The company I founded does essentially the same thing, legally, for government clients. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I did both, which is fairly undignified, but apparently what I do in moments of genuine relief. Aideen arrived within the hour. I'm not sure how she found out. Maybe the news alerts, maybe one of the other Thursday regulars, but she came through the door with her cane and a bottle of sparkling wine she had clearly been saving for something important. I knew it, she said, pointing at nothing in particular. I told you. I felt it in my bones. Bob from the framing shop 2 doors down showed up next, then the woman who owned the Vietnamese bakery across the street, then what felt like half of Sentrytown. By 4 o'clock, I had 50 people in a space meant for 20, all of them standing between boxes that suddenly felt very temporary. Eli stayed in the corner. He had a gift for disappearing into the background, despite being the reason any of us were standing there. I pulled him aside. Why? I asked. The same word I always came back to. You built a whole career. You could have just lived your life. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small book worn soft at the corners. Charlotte's Web. The copy I'd given him 16 years ago. He opened it to the first page. Eli. This one's yours. The world needs more people who notice things. Sylvie, January 2007. You wrote that like you meant it, he said. Nobody had ever said that to me before. That I noticed things. Like it was something good instead of something strange. He closed the book carefully. Every line of code I wrote, I was trying to become someone who deserved to be told that. I didn't have words for that. I'm not sure there are words for that. I just held on to the counter again, the same way I'd held on to it when he first walked through the door. What came next moved faster than I expected. The criminal proceedings drew substantial media attention. The CBC ran the story for 3 consecutive days, focusing on the broader scheme across 4 provinces, the 14 properties, the 11 leaseholders who'd been forced out. The Transit Authority launched its own internal investigation into the leak of the preliminary route data. 2 employees resigned before the investigation concluded. My uncle's lawyer entered a guilty plea on his client's behalf in January 2024. The evidence was apparently sufficient that going to trial wasn't something anyone wanted. He received 4 years. The will contest proceeded through civil court and was resolved in June. The forensic analysis was definitive enough that the judge didn't need long to deliberate. Gran's actual wishes, documented in an earlier will that Eli's investigator had found through probate records, were restored. The house had always been meant to be sold, with proceeds split between me and 3 local charities Gran had supported for years. Gareth Voss fought every charge for 8 months, and then, when 3 of his former associates accepted plea agreements and began cooperating, abruptly changed course. He received 9 years. The inspector who'd filed the false structural report received 18 months and a permanent prohibition from working in any capacity related to municipal inspection. 2 city officials who had delayed my permit applications in exchange for payments received 2 and 3 years respectively. The civil damages were resolved through mediated settlement rather than trial. My lawyer called me on a Thursday morning, a Thursday, which felt appropriate, Aideen's day, and told me the amount. I made her repeat it twice. Then I sat on the floor of the back room for the second time in 4 months, except this time I was not surrounded by boxes because I had unpacked everything in December, the day after the injunction came through, and put every single book back exactly where it belonged. Eli had a plan for the settlement money, naturally. He'd had a plan since before I knew there was going to be a settlement. He presented it to me in the shop one evening, just the 2 of us, in that methodical way of his. A folder, a spreadsheet, a series of careful projections. He wanted to create something called the Elgin Street Community Reading Room, keep the bookshop as the anchor, but expand the space next door. The framing shop was closing anyway, Bob had told me. His knees couldn't take it anymore, and build a free lending library for kids who didn't have library cards or couldn't get to the branch, a reading support program for adults with low literacy, a weekly drop-in for foster kids with the partnering organization he'd already identified. He'd built the budget down to the dollar. "You've been planning this," I said. "Since 2021, he said. "I thought we'd have more time before things came to a head." Voss accelerated his timeline when the transit route study was about to become public. "Ellie." I put my hand over the spreadsheet. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it worth doing." The reading room opened in April 2024. Aideen came with champagne again, better vintage this time, and made a speech that made everyone cry, including her, though she maintained afterward that she hadn't been crying. She'd had something in her eye for 20 minutes. The foster care organization sent 12 kids on the first Saturday. They spread out across the floor with picture books and early readers, and I watched them from behind the counter and thought about Eli at 11 years old, walking my shelves with both hands in his pockets so he wouldn't accidentally touch something that wasn't his. One of the 12 kids, a girl maybe 9 years old, found the copy of Charlotte's Web I'd put back in the children's section. She read the first page and looked up at me. "Who's Eli?" she asked. "He's someone who notices things," I said. She thought about that. "Is he coming in?" "He's in the back," I said. "He does the books." She went back to reading. I went back to the counter. The transit corridor expropriation became public in the fall of 2024. The LRT route was confirmed. The properties along the Elgin Street section, including mine, including the shop that Gran had opened in 1987, with $1,200 and a box of her own books and a jar of lemon drops on the counter, were assessed for expropriation compensation purposes. My lawyer called me again, same Thursday morning energy, made me repeat the number twice. I kept enough to secure the reading room's operations for 20 years and to renovate the shop properly, the way Gran always wanted but couldn't afford. The rest went to establish a legal fund for small leaseholders facing fraudulent eviction, a gap Eli had identified in the existing legal aid framework, a gap that was why 11 other people had given up when I hadn't. I keep Gran's jar of lemon drops on the counter. New candy, same jar, ceramic, pale yellow, shaped like a daisy. I restock it every Monday. I have not yet met a customer who stayed grumpy after a lemon drop. Gran's actual recipe card for the butternut squash soup is framed now, behind the register. Eli had it framed for the opening. He found the recipe in a box of her things I'd stored and forgotten about. Her handwriting, smudged at the edges from years of use. The measurements approximate in the way of someone who'd made it enough times that the recipe was in their hands more than on the paper. There's still a copy of Charlotte's Web in the children's section. Different edition now, newer cover. On the first page I've written, "To whoever needs this. The world needs more people who notice things. 2 kids have taken it this year." I keep replacing it. That feels right. Some things are meant to keep moving forward, from one set of hands to the next, carrying something that doesn't diminish when it's shared. Eli still does the books. Not because he needs to, his current work keeps him busier than I can keep track of, but because he says it keeps him grounded. On Thursday evenings sometimes, after the reading room closes, we sit in the back, and I make tea, and he brings food from somewhere, and we talk, the way people talk when they've known each other across a very long stretch of time. He asked me once if I ever regretted not taking Gareth Voss's $40,000 in 2009, all those years ago, avoiding everything that followed. I thought about it seriously. The inspections, the legal fees, the money orders I'd cashed without knowing who sent them, trying not to let myself hope too much. The 3 days I'd spent not touching the termination notice because I couldn't face it. "No," I told him, "because then I wouldn't have kept the shop. And if I hadn't kept the shop, you would have had nowhere to look for when you finally came back. And if you'd had nowhere to look for, you might not have come." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 40,000 versus 7 million in expropriation compensation and a federal fraud conviction. You made the correct financial decision. I threw a lemon drop at him. He caught it. He was always good at noticing things coming before they arrived.